In 1983, 3 graffiti writer boys disappeared in the train yard. The town was told they ran away, a simple story that never sat right with their grieving mothers. For decades, the case sat cold, a wound that refused to heal. But they didn't run away. 25 years later, a former night guard finally admits he knows what happened. He was there, he saw everything, and he was ordered to keep his mouth shut by a powerful man, concealing a truth so horrifying it would tear the community apart. What did that guard see that night? And who was willing to sacrifice 3 boys to protect a dark secret? Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The autumn air in Harmony Creek had a way of turning memories into ghosts. For Margaret Hale, 52 years old and the town's steadfast librarian, the ghosts usually stayed politely on the shelves, tucked between the brittle pages of old yearbooks and forgotten town histories. She was their keeper, the guardian of stories told and untold. On this particular Tuesday night in 2008, as the clock on the wall ticked past 9, she felt the familiar, peaceful quiet settle over the library. It was the sound of a day's work done, of books returned to their proper places, of a world put in order. She switched off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of the lamp on her checkout desk, its yellow circle a small island of warmth in the encroaching darkness. Her final task was always the same, checking the overnight drop box. It was usually just a few overdue novels, or a children's book dropped off by a hurried parent. But tonight, the metallic clang from inside the slot was followed by a soft, heavy thud. Not the familiar slide of a book, something else. Margaret unlocked the wooden cabinet beneath the slot, her movements practiced and slow. Inside, resting on a pile of returned paperbacks, was a plain manila envelope, thick and lumpy. It had no name, no address, no postage. It felt wrong in her hands, cold and impersonal. She carried it back to her desk, her curiosity pricked with a faint, unnameable unease. She sat in her worn leather chair, the silence of the library suddenly feeling less like peace and more like a held breath. Using a letter opener, she slit the envelope carefully, her librarian's instinct to preserve overriding her impatience. She tipped it over, and 2 objects slid out onto the polished wood of her desk. The first was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile as a dried leaf, folded into a neat square. The second was a small metal object that rattled against the desk with a sound like a lost coin. It was a spray paint cap, the kind kids used for graffiti. It was rusted a deep, angry orange along the edges, but she could still see the faint traces of what looked like faded red paint inside its nozzle. Her breath caught in her throat. Everyone in Harmony Creek who was old enough to remember knew what the color red meant. It was the signature tag of a boy named Leo, one of the 3 who had vanished. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the newspaper clipping. The headline was stark, printed in the bold, unforgiving ink of the past. 3 local teens believed runaways, community prays for safe return. The date at the top read October 12, 1983. 25 years. A lifetime ago. She scanned the article, the familiar, empty words swimming before her eyes. The boys, Leo, Sam, and Mikey, had last been seen near the old railway yard. The official police theory was that they had hopped a freight train, chasing some youthful dream of adventure, leaving their small town behind. It was a neat story, a tidy explanation that had allowed the town to eventually, uneasily, move on. But the mothers never believed it. Margaret remembered their faces from that time, hollowed out by a grief that had no end. The clipping itself was a relic, a piece of history she might have filed away in the town archives, but it was the writing on it that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Scrawled across the margin, in a faded blue ink that was barely visible, were 4 words. It wasn't the neat cursive of an older person or the frantic scribble of a madman. It was just plain, factual. As if stating a simple, terrifying truth, it said, "Ask the guard, he knows." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over her. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a piece of junk mail. This was a message, delivered from a quarter century of silence, and it had landed on her desk, in her library, in her hands. The rust on the spray paint cap felt like dried blood under her fingertips. Suddenly, the library felt too big, too dark. The rows of silent books seemed to be watching her. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was evidence. It contradicted everything the town had been told, everything it had chosen to believe. She needed to tell someone. Not the police, not yet. She didn't trust them to do anything but dismiss it, just as they had dismissed the mother's pleas all those years ago. There was only one person she could turn to, one person whose counsel she trusted above all others. Her brother, Paul. He was the pastor at the town's main church, a man whose life was built on faith and solace. He would know what to do. She carefully placed the clipping and the cap back into the envelope, her hands shaking so badly she almost tore the fragile paper. She locked up the library, the familiar clicks of the bolts sounding loud and final in the night, and drove the few blocks to the small house that stood beside the old stone church. Paul was in his study, a book open on his lap, the scent of old paper and brewing tea filling the air. He listened patiently as she laid out the envelope's contents on his coffee table, his brow furrowed with concern. He picked up the cap, turning it over in his fingers, his expression growing darker with every second that passed. Margaret expected him to share her shock, her sense of righteous urgency. She expected him to see what she saw, a crack of light in a long-sealed tomb. Instead, she saw fear. "Maggie, you need to be careful," he said, his voice low and strained. He pushed the items back toward her, as if they were contaminated. This is a wound, a deep one. You start poking at it, you don't know what you'll stir up. The town put this to rest." His words were a bucket of ice water. "Put it to rest, Paul? They never found them. 3 boys are gone. Their mothers are still here, still waiting. We can't just let this go." "Some things are better left," he insisted, his eyes pleading with her. People were angry back then. Angry at the boys for worrying everyone, angry at the police for not finding them. It almost tore this town apart. Bringing this up again, it's not safe. Let it be. Let it be. The words echoed in the quiet study, feeling like a betrayal. He was her brother, a man of God, and he was telling her to bury the truth. The town's comfort was more important than justice. As she drove home, Paul's fearful warning ringing in her ears, another memory rose to the surface, unbidden but fierce. She was a child again, sitting in one of Paul's pews, the week after the boys had disappeared. The whole town was a knot of anxiety and hushed whispers. She remembered staring up at the stained-glass window, the afternoon sun turning the saints into jewels of colored light, and she had prayed. It was a simple, desperate prayer from the heart of a little girl who couldn't comprehend how people could just vanish. "Lord," she had whispered into her folded hands, "please, just let their mothers know the truth someday. Please." It wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a vow made between her and her God, a promise she had forgotten until this very moment. Back in her small house, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the envelope and its contents laid out before her like a sacrament. Paul was wrong, the town was wrong, the neat, tidy story was a lie, and she now held the one thing that could unravel it all. The rusted spray paint cap seemed to pulse with a silent energy. It was more than a clue. It was a responsibility, a key. Her childhood prayer came back to her, not as a memory, but as a mandate. Let their mothers know the truth. Looking at the faded words, "Ask the guard, he knows." She knew this was her answer. The fear her brother had tried to instill in her was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else was rising to meet it, a resolve as hard and unyielding as steel. She would not let it be. She would find that guard, and she would make him talk. She had no idea who was watching, who had sent the package, or what dangers her brother saw so clearly. She only knew that she had made a promise, and after 25 years of silence, she was going to keep it. The next morning, the promise Margaret had made to herself felt both righteous and terrifyingly heavy. Paul's warning had settled deep in her bones, a cold counterpoint to the burning conviction in her heart. To let it be would be to become complicit in 25 years of silence. It would be a betrayal of the little girl who prayed for truth in a sunlit church, and a deeper betrayal of the mothers who were still living in a perpetual twilight of not knowing. She knew she couldn't march into the police station with a rusted cap and a cryptic note. They would dismiss her as a conspiracy, obsessed librarian. No, this had to be done quietly, carefully. She had to start with the heart of the story, with the people for whom the wound had never closed. She had to start with one of the mothers. She decided on Helen Dunlop, Sam's mother. In the weeks after the boys vanished, she had been the most vocal. Her grief, a raw, public spectacle. But as the years turned into decades, she had retreated into a silence more profound than any other, her house on Elm Street becoming a kind of fortress against the world's pity and forgetfulness. Driving to Mrs. Dunlop's small bungalow, Margaret felt a tremor of doubt. What right did she have to reopen this? What if Paul was right, and all she accomplished was to pour salt on a wound that had barely scabbed over? This was a mistake. A reckless, emotional decision born from a prayer made by a child. She almost turned the car around. "You're getting involved in something that has nothing to do with you," a voice in her head, one that sounded a lot like her brother, whispered. But then she pictured the rusted spray paint cap sitting on her kitchen table. It wasn't just an object, it was a plea. She parked the car and walked up the cracked concrete path, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs. The house seemed to be holding its breath. The paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown with weeds, a testament to a life paused. When Mrs. Dunlop opened the door, she looked smaller than Margaret remembered, a woman whittled down by time and sorrow. But her eyes, though clouded with age, were still fierce. They held the sharp, watchful look of someone who had learned long ago not to trust the world. "Margaret Hale," the old woman said, her voice thin but not frail. "The librarian, what do you want?" The welcome was not warm, but Margaret hadn't expected it to be. She asked if she could come in just for a moment, and after a long, scrutinizing pause, Mrs. Dunlop stepped aside. The inside of the house was a museum of a lost boy. Sam's school photos lined the mantelpiece, his face aging in yearly increments until it stopped, forever, at 16. A faded football trophy sat on a bookshelf next to a collection of model airplanes, gathering dust. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and grief. They sat in the dim living room, and Margaret spoke gently, explaining that she was doing some research for the library's historical archive, a lie that felt flimsy even as she said it. She spoke of the town's collective memory, of stories that get lost. Finally, with her hands trembling, she pulled the envelope from her bag and laid the newspaper clipping on the coffee table between them. She said nothing about the spray paint cap. Not yet. Mrs. Dunlop stared at the clipping, her face a mask of stone. Then Margaret pointed a single finger at the faded blue ink in the margin. "Ask the guard, he knows." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The careful dam of composure Mrs. Dunlop had built over 25 years crumbled into dust. A sound escaped her, a raw, ragged sob that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. The stone mask shattered, and beneath it was the face of a mother whose child had been stolen from her. "I knew it," she whispered, the words choked with tears. "I always knew it. They weren't runaways. My Sammy, he wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. He wouldn't have." She confessed what she had buried for so long, the unshakable, gut-wrenching certainty that her son was still out there, or that his ending was far more sinister than the tidy story the police had sold the town. To believe he had run away was to believe he had abandoned her. To believe he had met with foul play was unbearable. So she lived in the impossible space in between, a hell of her own making, clinging to a thread of hope so thin it was invisible to everyone but her. Then, seeing something in Margaret's eyes, not pity, but a reflection of her own desperate need for truth, Mrs. Dunlop's expression shifted. The fierce light returned. "They thought I was a hysterical old woman," she said, her voice gaining a strength fueled by decades of suppressed rage. "They told me to accept it, to move on. How do you move on from your own child?" She rose from her chair, her movements stiff but resolute, and went to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer she retrieved a small, yellowed postcard. She held it as if it were the most sacred relic in the world. She handed it to Margaret. The picture on the front was a generic image of a desert landscape, but it was the back that made Margaret's blood run cold. The postmark was from 1985, 2 years after the boys disappeared. There was no return address, and written in the same simple, blocky handwriting as the note on the newspaper clipping were just 2 words: "Still here." Hope, sharp and blinding, surged through Margaret. It was a jolt of electricity, a confirmation that her instincts were right. This wasn't just a hunch or a ghost story. This was real. A piece of tangible evidence that the official story was a lie. "The police," Margaret started, her voice barely a whisper. "They said it was a cruel prank." "Mrs." Dunlop said, bitterness lacing every word. "They told me some kids probably sent it to torment me. They didn't even file it as evidence. They just gave it back. So I kept it. It was all I had." Margaret left the small, suffocating house feeling as if she could fly. The quiet librarian, the keeper of other people's stories, was now part of the most important story Harmony Creek had ever known. She had found the first crack in the wall of silence. The postcard was a beginning. It was proof. She felt a profound connection to the grieving woman she'd just left, a shared mission that transcended time and pain. Driving away, a sense of triumphant purpose filled her. Paul was wrong. The town was wrong. The truth didn't want to stay buried. Later that night, leaving the library after a late shift cataloging new arrivals, the feeling of victory was still warm in her chest. The cool night air felt clean and sharp. She got into her old sedan, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. The road home was dark, winding through a stretch of woods just outside of town. The streetlights were few and far between, her headlights cutting a lonely tunnel through the blackness. Her mind was racing, replaying Mrs. Dunlop's trembling confession, the 2 stark words on the postcard burning behind her eyes. "Still here." Who sent it? Was it one of the boys? Or someone else? Someone who knew. She approached the sharpest turn on the road, a downhill curve that required a firm touch on the brakes, especially at night. It was a corner she'd navigated 1,000 times. She took her foot off the accelerator and pressed it onto the brake pedal. And nothing happened. Her foot went straight to the floor, meeting no resistance, just empty space. A sickening, weightless lurch seized her stomach as the car continued to pick up speed, hurtling toward the dark maw of the curve. Panic, pure and primal, shot through her. She slammed the pedal again and again. Nothing. The dark shapes of trees loomed in her headlights, rushing toward her like giant, skeletal hands. She yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, the tires screaming in protest as the car swerved violently, its back end fishtailing across the asphalt. The world became a blur of screeching rubber and flashing trees. She braced for the inevitable, crushing impact. In a last, desperate act, she pulled the emergency brake. The car shuddered, groaned, and finally skidded to a halt sideways in the middle of the empty road, just inches from a thick oak tree. Silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart and the ticking of the cooling engine. She sat in the dark, her hands fused to the steering wheel, knuckles white. The smell of burnt rubber filled the car. And then the cold, horrifying realization washed over her. Brake lines don't just fail. Not like that. This was no accident. This was a message, a warning. Someone knew she had been to see Mrs. Dunlop. Someone was watching, and they were willing to do more than just leave anonymous notes in her drop box. They were willing to kill her to keep the silence. The silence in the aftermath of the screeching tires was a living thing. It pressed in on Margaret from all sides, heavy and suffocating. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a painful reminder that she was still alive. For a long time, she didn't move. She simply stared at the massive oak tree, its bark illuminated in the skewed glare of her headlights, the final inch of space between its unyielding trunk and her crumpled fender feeling like a miracle and a curse all at once. The mechanic's words the next morning were blunt, delivered with the grim finality of a doctor giving a terminal diagnosis. "This wasn't wear and tear, Maggie. Your brake line was cut. Clean through. Someone wanted you to have an accident." The words hung in the greasy air of the garage, confirming a terror that had already taken root in the deepest part of her soul. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was a calculated, vicious response. They hadn't just been watching her visit Mrs. Dunlop, they had been waiting. The thrilling sense of purpose she had felt was gone, replaced by a cold, numbing fear that followed her everywhere. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every passing car a potential enemy. Paul's worried face flashed in her mind over and over. "You don't know what you'll stir up," he'd warned. She knew now. She was stirring up a monster. For 2 days, she did nothing. The envelope with its rusted cap and damning newspaper clipping sat hidden in a locked drawer in her desk, its presence a constant, silent accusation. She went to the library, stamped books, and answered questions about overdue fines. Her smile, a brittle mask she wore to hide the terror churning inside her. She felt like a fool, a naive librarian playing at being a detective who had almost gotten herself killed. The vow she had made felt childish and reckless in the face of such a real and violent threat. Maybe Paul was right. Maybe some truths were meant to stay buried because digging them up meant burying yourself. She was on the verge of taking the envelope to the Old Town incinerator, of burning the evidence and the prayer that had set her on this path, when he walked into her library. He was a man who wore his history like a well-tailored suit. Richard Crowe was in his 70s, but he carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been questioned. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his face weathered but handsome, the kind of face people instinctively trusted. He was a town institution, the retired railway safety officer who had been celebrated for decades as a community guardian, a hero who had supposedly made the dangerous rail yard a safer place. Margaret knew him the way everyone in Harmony Creek did, as a pillar of the community, a frequent donor to the library, a man whose presence commanded respect. He approached her desk with a warm, disarming smile, complimenting a new display of local history she had arranged. But his eyes were cold, sharp chips of ice that held no warmth at all. "Margaret, my dear," he began, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that was used to being obeyed. "I so admire your passion for our town's history. It's a noble calling, preserving the past." He paused, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "But some stories, some old ghosts, they are best left undisturbed. For the good of the community." His words were a silken rope tightening around her throat. He didn't mention the boys. He didn't mention the train yard or brake lines. He didn't have to. The message was terrifyingly clear. "You're a sensible woman," he continued, his smile never faltering. "You understand that order and peace are delicate things. You wouldn't want to be the one to shatter them over some forgotten piece of adolescent foolishness, would you?" He pulled an ornate gold pocket watch from his vest, flipping the cover open and shut with a soft click. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, final. "Some things are buried for a reason." He gave her a final, paternalistic nod and walked away, leaving a profound chill in his wake. The air in the library suddenly felt thin, unbreathable. It wasn't just a warning, it was a display of power. He was telling her that he knew everything, that he was untouchable, and that her life was in his hands. The town hero was the monster. That evening, as Margaret was locking the heavy oak doors of the library, her hands still shaking from the encounter, a figure stepped out of the deepening shadows. Her heart leapt into her throat, a scream catching in her chest. She fumbled for her keys, her mind flashing back to the car, to the darkness, to the tree. "Mrs. Hale? Margaret?" The voice was young, hesitant, and laced with concern. It wasn't Crowe. She looked up to see a man in his late 30s, dressed in the dark blue uniform of a security guard. He had kind, tired eyes and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled much recently. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. My name is Eddie Ramirez. I'm the new night, guard down at the rail yard." Margaret stared at him, her fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I heard a rumor," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Heard you were asking around about what happened back in '83, about the boys." Her blood ran cold again. How? How did this man know? Was he with Crowe? Was this another trap? But then he looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was not one of threat, but of a shared, hidden pain. "Look, I know this is going to sound crazy," he said, his voice dropping low. But some of the old-timers, the ones who were around back then, they talk. When they think no one's listening, they whisper things. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. They whisper about something being buried under Track 9 right before they laid the new concrete slab. Track 9, the words hit Margaret like a physical blow, a specific place, a target. This wasn't just a vague hint on a newspaper clipping anymore, it was a location, a place where a secret, and maybe 3 boys, had been sealed away. For the first time since her car had skidded to a halt on that dark road, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in her chest. She wasn't alone in this. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, studying his face, searching for any hint of deception. Eddie looked down at his worn work boots, a shadow passing over his features. "I lost my older brother a long time ago," he said, his voice thick with an old familiar grief. "It was a work accident, that's what they called it. But there were things that never added up, whispers just like these. Nobody listened." His file just got stamped closed. "I know what it's like for a family to be left with nothing but questions." He met her gaze again, and in his eyes she saw not just an ally, but a fellow traveler in the land of the forgotten. He understood. This rush of connection, of finding a partner in this lonely, terrifying quest, was so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. She wasn't just a librarian in over her head anymore. She was part of a team. "We have to be careful," she said, the words coming out in a rush, a plan forming even as she spoke. "They tampered with my car. I was almost killed." The confession felt good, real, spoken to someone who wouldn't tell her she was crazy. "From now on, we have a buddy system. I won't meet anyone alone. I won't go anywhere new alone. Neither will you. We have to protect each other." Eddie nodded, a look of grim understanding on his face. Agreed. He promised to keep his ears open and to look for old schematics of the yard, anything that might show what Track 9 looked like before 1983. As he turned to leave, a wave of relief washed over Margaret. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but now it was balanced by a fierce, shared resolve. She watched him walk down the street, his figure disappearing into the twilight. For the first time in days, she felt she could breathe again, but then her eyes were drawn to a spot across the street, a little way down from the library entrance. A dark sedan was parked under the flickering orange glow of a streetlight. It was nondescript, black, with windows so darkly tinted you couldn't see inside. It had been there when Eddie approached. It was still there now. The engine was off, but it felt alive, watchful, a predator waiting patiently in the shadows. Had it been there all night? Was it the same car she'd seen in her rearview mirror before? Her newfound hope curdled into a fresh spike of dread. Was Eddie's appearance a godsend? Or had she just been handed a new friend by the very people who wanted her dead? The sight of the black sedan sent a new kind of fear through Margaret, colder and more insidious than the raw panic she'd felt on the road. It was the fear of being watched, of having every move scrutinized by an unseen enemy. Was Eddie a friend or bait? Was his story of a lost brother genuine, or a carefully crafted lie designed to earn her trust? For the next 48 hours, she lived with this gnawing uncertainty. She saw the sedan parked near her house in the morning, and again near the library in the afternoon. It never got closer, never made a move. It just sat there, a silent, menacing promise of what Crow was capable of. The paranoia was suffocating. Every phone call made her jump. Every creak of her old house at night sounded like an intruder. She found herself peering through her blinds like a prisoner, mapping the patterns of the unfamiliar car. Her quest for truth had turned her own life into a cage. Just as the suspicion was beginning to poison her resolve, Eddie called. He didn't use the library's main line. He called her personal cell, a number only a few people had. "Meet me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The archives. There's a back entrance off Miller Street. Nobody uses it. I have something." The specificity of his instructions, the clear understanding of the need for secrecy, was a small but powerful reassurance. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to trap her. This was the behavior of someone who was just as scared as she was. She agreed to meet him that night, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fear and hope. Walking through the darkened back corridors of the rail yard's administrative building felt like stepping into the past. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten paperwork, the silence broken only by the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. Eddie led her with a small flashlight to a cramped, dusty room filled with shelves of decaying cardboard boxes and heavy, leather-bound ledgers. "These are the old scheduling and maintenance logs," he whispered, shining his light on a towering stack of books. Everything from 1950 to the early 90s. For hours, they worked in the musty silence, pulling down the heavy volumes, their fingers black with dust. Margaret's skills as a librarian took over, a methodical calm settling over her as she focused on the task. They were looking for any mention of construction, repairs, or unusual activity around Track 9 in the fall of 1983. The work was grueling, the old records filled with technical jargon and the mundane details of a railway's daily life. It felt like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. But as they worked side by side, sharing a thermos of coffee Eddie had brought, Margaret began to feel the tight knot of suspicion in her chest slowly unwind. He talked more about his brother, about the casual cruelty of the company that had dismissed his death as a statistic, about the guilt he still carried for not being old enough, or brave enough, to demand answers back then. "They make you feel small," he said, his eyes dark with memory. "They make you feel like your grief is an inconvenience. I can't let that happen to those mothers." In that moment, sitting in a forgotten basement surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Margaret knew she could trust him. His pain was real. His motivation was as pure as her own. The alliance was no longer a matter of strategy, it was a bond forged in shared loss. And then they found it. Tucked inside the ledger for 1983, they discovered not what they were looking for, but the absence of it. A single page had been meticulously cut from the book, right where the entries for the week of October 10th should have been, the week the boys disappeared. A ragged edge, sliced with a razor-sharp blade, was all that remained. It was a clean, deliberate act of destruction, a hole in the official record, precisely where the truth should have been. Someone had come here, years ago, and surgically removed the evidence. The discovery was electrifying. It was proof of a cover-up, as solid and irrefutable as a signed confession. Hope surged through Margaret, fierce and bright. They were closer than ever. They were on the right path. Later that night, exhausted but exhilarated, they sat at Margaret's kitchen table, the empty coffee mugs a small testament to their shared victory. The house felt warm and safe, a small sanctuary against the darkness outside. For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel alone. She felt the quiet strength of partnership, of two people standing together against a shared enemy. It was a fleeting, precious moment of peace, a breath of air before the next plunge. She told Eddie about Crow, about his veiled threats, and the terrifying click of his pocket watch. He listened intently, his expression hardening. "He's the one," Eddie said, his voice a low growl. "He's the monster." The camaraderie, the shared mission, felt like the beginning of something powerful, something that could actually win. The next evening, when Eddie arrived for his shift at the rail yard, his world was turned upside down. His locker had been pried open, the metal door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Everything inside, his change of clothes, his lunchbox, a photo of his brother, had been thrown on the floor and doused in what smelled like motor oil. And resting on top of the ruined mess was a single grease-stained piece of paper. The words were written in the same blocky, impersonal letters as the note on the clipping and the postcard to Mrs. Dunlop. But this message wasn't cryptic, it was brutally direct. "The guard keeps his mouth shut, or others vanish too." Eddie's blood ran cold. The threat was unmistakable. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, about anyone he cared about. The hope they had found in that dusty archive was now tainted with a new, more personal terror. Crow wasn't just trying to scare Margaret off, he was escalating. He had violated Eddie's personal space, destroyed a picture of his lost brother, and made a threat that promised a fate identical to the one the three boys had met. The message was clear. There was no line he wouldn't cross. The hunt was no longer about uncovering a story, it was about survival. The violation of Eddie's locker felt like a personal assault to Margaret. The message, scrawled with such casual cruelty, was a brutal escalation. It transformed their quest from a quiet search for truth into a high-stakes war against an enemy who had no rules. The fear was no longer a shapeless dread. It had a name, Richard Crowe, and a face, smiling and benevolent, that masked a soul as cold and hard as the steel rails he once commanded. They met that night not at Margaret's house, which no longer felt safe, but in a secluded booth at a 24-hour diner on the highway, miles outside of Harmony Creek. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, but it felt secure, anonymous. Eddie was pale, his usual quiet strength replaced by a haunted, jittery energy. He kept glancing toward the door, his hand resting on his knee as if to stop it from shaking. "They knew, Margaret," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They knew we were in the archives. There's no other way." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just been followed, they had been anticipated. Crowe's network of eyes and ears reached further than she could have imagined. They were two ordinary people trying to fight a ghost who had the whole town in his pocket. It felt hopeless. Despair, thick and cloying, settled over their small table. Maybe Paul was right, Margaret heard herself say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Maybe we should just stop, before someone really gets hurt. Before it's not just a threat. Eddie looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flickering neon of the diner sign. The fear was still there, but underneath it, a stubborn ember of defiance was beginning to glow. "And let him win?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Let him get away with it?" "They desecrated a photo of my brother, Margaret. They made this personal. I'm not backing down now." His courage shamed her. His righteous anger was a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of surrender. She had started this to honor a prayer, to bring peace to the mothers. She couldn't abandon them now, not when she was so close to the truth. She couldn't abandon Eddie. The original clue, the one that had started it all, echoed in her mind. "Ask the guard. He knows." For weeks, she had assumed the note referred to any guard, a generic figure from the past. But what if it meant a specific guard? The guard on duty that exact night? Her librarian's mind, trained to find patterns and follow threads of information, kicked into high gear. She needed employee records, duty rosters from 1983. The rail yard's official archives were a dead end, compromised and likely stripped of anything useful. But the library had its own archives, a sprawling collection of town records, old newspapers, and donated business ledgers. It was a long shot, a desperate, needle in a haystack search, but it was all they had left. For the next week, she buried herself in the library's basement, a place even she rarely visited. It was a labyrinth of forgotten history, the air cool and dry. She painstakingly combed through donated payroll documents from the railway company, cross-referencing names with old town directories, building a fragile map of the men who had worked the night shift in October of 1983. Most of the names led to dead ends, men who had moved away or who had passed on decades ago. But one name stood out, Herbert Knox. According to a small note in a company newsletter from 1990, he had been awarded a plaque for 20 years of perfect attendance before taking an early retirement due to health reasons. He was still listed in the most recent town directory. He was alive, and he was living at the Harmony Creek Care Facility, just on the other side of town. The hope was so sudden and overwhelming it made her feel dizzy. This was it. This had to be him, the guard. When she and Eddie went to the facility, they found a man who was a ghost of a different sort. Herbert Knox, now 78, was a frail, shrunken figure hunched in a wheelchair in a sunlit common room, staring blankly at a television that wasn't on. The respected, diligent employee from the company newsletter was gone, replaced by a man hollowed out by secrets, his eyes filled with a perpetual, hunted fear. At first he refused to speak to them, shaking his head and staring at the floor whenever they mentioned the rail yard. The nurses explained he rarely spoke to anyone, that he was lost in his own world. Margaret felt a crushing wave of disappointment. They had come all this way, taken so many risks, only to be met with a wall of silence from a broken mind. But she wouldn't give up. She came back the next day, alone. She didn't bring up the rail yard. She brought him a cup of coffee and a book of photographs of old Harmony Creek. She talked about the library, about the changing seasons, her voice calm and gentle. She visited him every day for a week, slowly, patiently building a fragile bridge of trust over the chasm of his fear. She learned to read his tells, the way his hands would tremble, the way his gaze would dart toward the door. On the 5th day, she sat with him in the quiet garden behind the facility. The scent of roses hung in the air. "Herbert," she said softly, "I know you were there that night, the night the boys disappeared. You don't have to be afraid anymore. All we want is the truth. Their mothers deserve to know the truth." He began to shake, a low, guttural sound of pure anguish escaping his lips. And then, the dam of silence that had held for 25 years finally broke. "They didn't run away," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping thing, unused to forming such heavy words. "They were just kids, being stupid, sneaked into the yard to tag a line of boxcars on the old siding." His eyes squeezed shut, as if replaying a scene he had been forced to watch 1,000 times. He told her how that night, an unscheduled freight car, supposedly empty for maintenance, was being moved. He saw the boys slip inside the open door, thinking it was just sitting on the siding. But then the shunting engine came. He saw the heavy steel door slide shut, heard the pneumatic lock engage with a deafening hiss. He ran, he shouted, but the yard was loud, the engine's roar drowning out his cries. He got to the control booth just as the car was being sealed. He screamed at the operator to stop, but his supervisor was there, and his supervisor was Richard Crow. "Crow just looked at me," Knox rasped, tears now streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. He said, "They're just delinquents, Herbert, trespassers. We have a schedule to keep. Let it go." Knox, a simple man terrified of losing his job, his pension, his entire life, had obeyed. He had stood there and watched as the boxcar was coupled to the train and rolled out of the yard, a sealed metal coffin carrying 3 boys to their doom. The confession was a horror beyond anything Margaret could have imagined, not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act. An execution. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over her. She pulled out a small tape recorder she had brought, her hands shaking. "Herbert, you have to say this again. We have to record this. For their mothers." But just as he opened his mouth, a shadow fell over them. "Well, hello there, Herbert. I thought I'd stop by and see how my favorite old colleague was doing." The voice was smooth, charming, and utterly reptilian. Richard Crow stood there, smiling, holding a bouquet of flowers for the nurse's station. He exuded an aura of calm authority, the beloved town benefactor paying a friendly visit. Knox visibly shrank in his wheelchair, the color draining from his face. The terror in his eyes was absolute. Crow gave Margaret a slow, deliberate look, his smile never reaching his eyes. And in that one look, she understood everything. He wasn't just here by chance. He knew. He had followed her. He was showing her, once again, that he was always one step ahead. Knox clamped his mouth shut, his brief moment of courage extinguished as if it had never been. The confession, the key to everything, was lost, swallowed back into the silence by the mere presence of the monster himself. Leaving the care facility felt like a retreat from a battlefield. The truth had been right there, a tangible thing in the air between them, only to be snatched away by Crow's perfectly timed, malevolent appearance. The casual way he'd charmed the nurses, handing them the flowers while simultaneously terrorizing an old man into silence, was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Margaret drove away in a daze, the engine's hum, a low, mournful sound. The victory had been so close, so real, she had tasted it. Now all she could taste was the bitterness of defeat. Crow hadn't just silenced Knox. He had reminded her that he was everywhere, that no witness was safe, and that he would always be one step ahead. It was a checkmate. She felt a profound and gut-wrenching sense of failure. She had made a promise to the mothers, a vow to God, and she had failed. All she had done was put herself, Eddie, and now a terrified old man in the crosshairs of a monster. The rage she'd felt at Knox's confession was now replaced by a chilling impotence. What could a librarian and a night guard possibly do against a man who could command such loyalty and fear, who could erase history and silence the truth with a simple, smiling visit? That night she found herself on her brother's doorstep, not for counsel this time, but for solace. She needed the comfort of the familiar, the simple, uncomplicated presence of her family. She told Paul everything: the postcard, the cut brake lines, the ransacked locker, and finally, Knox's horrifying confession and Crow's sudden appearance. She expected another "I told you so," another cautious plea to let it be. Instead, she saw a new emotion flicker in his eyes: shame. He listened, his face pale, his usual calm demeanor crumbling as the true depravity of Crow's actions became clear. When she finished, the silence in his study was heavy with unspoken history. "Maggie," he began, his voice strained, "there's something I never told anyone." He confessed that on the night the boys disappeared, he and some friends, just teenagers themselves, had been down by the woods that bordered the rail yard. It was late. They weren't supposed to be there. He remembered seeing a set of headlights pull up to a locked service gate and a figure getting out. It was Richard Crow. He had a brief, angry-looking conversation with the guard on duty, a man Paul now realized must have been Herbert Knox, before getting back in his car and speeding away. "I didn't think anything of it," Paul said, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clenched into tight fists in his lap. "He was the safety officer. I figured it was just business. But when the news broke about the boys, I felt this cold dread. I knew I should have said something, told the police I saw him there. But I was scared. We weren't supposed to be out. I didn't want to get in trouble, so I kept my mouth shut." The confession hung between them, a 25-year-old secret that had festered in the dark. His silence, born of youthful fear, had helped build the very wall they were now trying to tear down. It was a quiet complicity that had allowed Crow's lie to take root and grow into an unshakable town legend. Margaret felt a surge of empathy for the boy her brother had been, even as she grappled with the weight of his admission. He wasn't telling her to stop anymore. His own long-buried guilt had finally brought him over to her side. "We have to expose him, Maggie," he said, his voice finding a new, unshakable firmness. "Whatever it takes." For the first time in this entire ordeal, Margaret felt a profound sense of hope, not just for the case, but for her brother. He was choosing courage over comfort. Praying together that night, Margaret felt the weight on her shoulders lighten, not because the path ahead was any less dangerous, but because she no longer had to walk it alone. This fragile sense of hope was shattered less than 24 hours later. Crow, realizing that intimidation was no longer enough, struck back not with physical threats, but with a cold, bureaucratic cruelty that was even more terrifying. Margaret received a call from the mayor's office. There had been an anonymous, but very serious, complaint filed against the library concerning mismanagement of funds and inappropriate use of public resources. Her budget, already stretched thin, was being frozen pending a full, and likely very slow, investigation. Her job, the place that had been her sanctuary and her life's work, was now a weapon being used against her. The message was surgical in its precision. "You want to dig into my history? I will destroy your future." The attack was so audacious, so public, it left her reeling. Crow wasn't just a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a master manipulator, able to pull the strings of the entire town, turning its institutions against anyone who dared to challenge him. The news spread through Harmony Creek like a virus. Suddenly, people who had known her for years looked at her with suspicion. The library, once a beloved community hub, was now the subject of whispered rumors and distrustful glances. Crow had successfully painted her not as a truth-seeker, but as an unstable, fiscally irresponsible troublemaker. The outrage Margaret felt was so profound it was almost paralyzing. He was poisoning her reputation, dismantling her life piece by piece, all while wearing the mask of a concerned citizen. It was a public execution of her character. That evening, as she and Eddie drove to a clandestine meeting in a neighboring town, the danger felt more immediate than ever. The fight was no longer contained to dusty archives and hushed conversations. It was out in the open, and she was losing. "He's isolating you," Eddie said, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. turning the town against you so that when he finally crushes you, no one will care. And then he saw it. The same black sedan that had been parked outside the library. It was 2 cars back, keeping a steady, patient distance. It had been following them since they left her house. The whispers and sabotage had now escalated to active, blatant surveillance. They were no longer just being watched, they were being stalked. Eddie's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low, determined growl. He made a sudden, unsignaled right turn, tires squealing, and accelerated down a dark side street. The sedan, caught off guard for a split second, followed suit, its movements now aggressive, predatory. Eddie wove through a series of residential streets, his driving skillful and precise, but the sedan stuck to them like a shadow. It was a relentless, terrifying pursuit that confirmed their worst fears. They were no longer just up against an old man's influence, they were up against his resources, his enforcers. Crow had unleashed his dogs. Finally, Eddie shot through a yellow light and swerved into the parking lot of a busy supermarket, killing the engine and headlights, hoping they could disappear into the crowd of evening shoppers. The black sedan paused at the entrance to the lot for a long, menacing moment, its dark windows reflecting the store's bright lights, before it slowly, deliberately pulled away and vanished into the night. They sat in the silent car, the manufactured cheerfulness of the supermarket, a bizarre backdrop to their terror. They had escaped, for now, but they both knew this was a turning point. The rules had changed. The monster was no longer content to just guard its secrets, it was now actively hunting them. The car chase left a permanent, icy residue of fear in its wake. It was one thing to be threatened, to find a note in a ransacked locker. It was another thing entirely to be hunted. The transition from psychological warfare to active pursuit meant they were running out of time. Crow was no longer trying to scare them into submission. He was moving to eliminate the threat entirely. The terror was a constant companion now, a cold pressure behind Margaret's eyes. Then, as if to underscore the finality of their struggle, a new sign went up on the chain-link fence surrounding the old rail yard. It was a large, brightly colored placard announcing a new commercial development. The notice was stark and impersonal. Demolitions scheduled to begin in 1 week. 1 week. In 7 days, the entire yard, including Track 9, would be ripped up, churned into rubble, and paved over to make way for a soulless strip mall. The secret buried there would be lost forever, sealed under a new layer of concrete and asphalt, erased from history as completely as the page torn from that old ledger. The deadline turned their fear into a frantic, desperate energy. This was their last chance. They couldn't wait for another witness or a misplaced document. They had to go to the source. They had to get to whatever was buried under Track 9. The decision was reckless, a Hail Mary born of pure desperation, and a part of Margaret, the cautious, rule-following librarian, screamed that it was madness. This was breaking and entering, a blatant criminal act. If they were caught, her already tarnished reputation would be destroyed for good. Crow would have everything he needed to paint her as an unhinged fanatic, and any truth they uncovered would be buried along with their credibility. "You're throwing away your entire life on a whisper and a prayer," the voice of reason, of fear, told her. But the image of the mothers' faces, of Mrs. Dunlop clutching that faded postcard, of the terror in Herbert Knox's eyes, was stronger. What was her reputation compared to their lifetime of suffering? This wasn't a choice anymore, it was an obligation. Eddie spent 2 nights carefully studying the demolition crew's preliminary work, mapping their schedules, the placement of security lights, and the blind spots in the fence. He drew a crude map on a napkin, marking their entry point and a path through the darkened yard that would keep them in the shadows. His plan was meticulous, his focus absolute. This was his world, a place of mechanics and security routines he understood better than anyone. His quiet competence was a comforting anchor in Margaret's sea of anxiety. The night they chose was moonless and overcast, a thick blanket of clouds swallowing the stars and plunging the derelict rail yard into an inky blackness. The air was heavy and still. As they slipped through a gap Eddie had cut in the fence, the familiar world of Harmony Creek fell away, and they entered a place outside of time, a graveyard of forgotten industry. The silence was immense. broken only by the crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant howl of a lone train. Rusting boxcars loomed around them like sleeping iron beasts, their sides covered in layers of faded graffiti, the ghosts of boys like Leo, Sam, and Mikey. Knox, in a brief, trembling phone call arranged by a sympathetic nurse, had given them a landmark. "The old water tower," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible. "Count 40 paces east from the base. It was a concrete slab even back then. They just poured a new one right over it." Guided by the dim beam of Eddie's flashlight, they found the water tower, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple of the night sky. From its base, they paced off the 40 steps, the number feeling both sacred and arbitrary. Their steps ended at a wide, featureless expanse of concrete marked with a faded, stenciled number 9. It looked impenetrable, a solid, seamless tombstone. Despair began to creep in. How could they possibly break through this? But Eddie had come prepared. From his duffel bag, he pulled a heavy sledgehammer and a long steel pry bar. The first strike of the hammer against the concrete was a deafening crack that seemed to rip through the fabric of the night. It echoed across the silent yard, and Margaret froze, her heart seizing with the certainty that they had just announced their presence to the entire world. But no lights came on. No alarms blared. There was only the ringing in their ears and the vast, indifferent silence. Eddie worked with a grim, focused intensity, his breaths coming in harsh grunts. He swung the sledgehammer over and over, his muscles straining, sweat beading on his forehead. Each blow sent spiderwebs of cracks across the surface. After what felt like an eternity, a chunk of the top layer broke away, revealing older, darker concrete underneath. It was just as Knox had said. They were through the first layer. Using the pry bar, they worked at the edges of the older slab, a layer of earth and grime, having sealed it tight over the decades. It was slow, agonizing work. Every scrape of the steel bar against the stone sounded like a gunshot to Margaret's frayed nerves. She stood watch, her body rigid with tension, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Finally, with a deep groan of protest, a section of the old slab shifted. A dark, rectangular opening appeared, releasing a cold, musty smell of damp earth and decay. Hope, raw and electrifying, shot through Margaret, chasing away the fear. They had done it. They had opened the tomb. Eddie shone his flashlight into the darkness. It wasn't a grave, but a small, forgotten maintenance crawlspace, barely 3 feet high. But in the center of the dusty floor, nestled in the dirt, was a small, metallic object. It glinted in the flashlight's beam. Margaret reached in, her hand trembling, and picked it up. It was a whistle. A simple, rusted metal train whistle, the kind a kid would treasure. And etched crudely into its side, worn but still legible, were 3 sets of initials: L, D, S, D, M, R. Leo Dunlop, Sam Dunlop, Mikey Rodriguez. A sob escaped Margaret's lips. It wasn't their bodies, but it was proof, undeniable proof they had been here. It was one of the boys' most prized possessions, a belonging their mothers had described in tearful detail to the police all those years ago. It was a piece of them, left behind in their final moments. Clutching the whistle, a feeling of triumphant, sorrowful vindication washed over her. They had it. They had the truth in the palm of their hand. And then, the world exploded in a blinding white light. Floodlights from atop the nearby buildings blazed to life, instantly vaporizing the shadows and pinning them in a merciless glare. They were exposed, trapped like insects under a magnifying glass. Figures emerged from the darkness, blocking their only escape route. 2 large, menacing men flanked a third, smaller figure. As he stepped into the brilliant light, Margaret's blood ran cold. It was Richard Crowe. He was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes glittering with a triumphant hatred. He pulled his gold pocket watch from his vest. Click! "Truth doesn't build towns, Margaret," he sneered, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. "Order does. And you, my dear, have become a threat to order." As his hired men started to advance, Eddie acted on pure instinct. He grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her back toward the main yard, and slammed his hand down on a large, red emergency alarm box on a nearby signal post. A deafening, whooping siren shattered the night. The sound was a shockwave, sending Crow and his men reeling for a split second in surprise. It was the only chance they would get. "Run!" Eddie screamed, and they plunged back into the chaotic labyrinth of the rail yard, the blare of the alarm chasing them into the darkness. The wail of the emergency alarm was a sound of both salvation and damnation. It gave them the precious seconds they needed to escape, but it also ensured there would be no quiet retreat, no fading back into the anonymous shadows of Harmony Creek. They had kicked the hornet's nest, and now the whole town was about to feel the sting. They ran blindly, their lungs burning, the dissonant shriek of the siren pursuing them through the maze of rusting metal. All Margaret could think about was the small, cold weight of the whistle clutched in her hand. It felt impossibly heavy, a relic imbued with the lost lives of 3 boys. They burst through the hole in the fence and didn't stop running until the sounds of the yard, the alarm, the shouting of Crow's men, faded behind them, replaced by the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They didn't go to her house or his apartment. They knew both places would be watched. Instead, they went to the one place that felt like a true sanctuary, Paul's church. They found him in his office, awakened by their frantic pounding on the rectory door. He took one look at their dirt-streaked faces, their ragged breathing, and the wild terror in their eyes, and ushered them inside without a word. Margaret unfurled her fist and placed the whistle on his polished mahogany desk. In the soft lamplight, the crudely etched initials seemed to glow. "It was them, Paul," she whispered, her voice cracking. They were there. The weight of their narrow escape, of Crow's unconcealed fury, of holding the first real piece of evidence in 25 years, crashed down on her all at once. She finally broke, collapsing into a chair and sobbing, the tears a release of weeks of accumulated fear and grief and rage. Eddie stood by the window, his body rigid, still on high alert, his gaze sweeping the empty street outside. Paul picked up the whistle, his face a mixture of awe and profound sorrow. The pastor's caution was gone, burned away by the undeniable truth of the object in his hand. "The town has to know," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction Margaret had never heard from him before. "We can't go to the police. Not yet. Crow owns them. We have to go around them." The decision was made in that quiet, hallowed room. There was only one person in town who had the integrity and the courage to stand up to a man like Richard Crow. Sarah Jenkins was a young, tenacious reporter for the local paper, known for her unwillingness to back down from a tough story. She was their last and only hope. The next morning, looking haggard and running on pure adrenaline, Margaret and Eddie met Sarah at a coffee shop in the next town over. Margaret laid out the whole story, her voice steady now, fueled by a righteous fire. She presented the artifacts one by one: the rusted spray paint cap, the faded newspaper clipping, the cryptic postcard, and finally, the rusted whistle. Sarah Jenkins listened, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to wide-eyed shock, her pen flying across her notepad. She recognized the story for what it was. Not just a cold case, but a conspiracy, a cover-up that reached to the very heart of the town's power structure. She promised them she would protect them as sources and that she would publish the story on the front page of the Sunday edition. That single act of speaking to the press was like lighting a fuse. The story, when it broke, was an explosion. It ripped through the sleepy, complacent quiet of Harmony Creek with the force of a bomb. The headline was stark: "Missing Boys Mystery. Librarian uncovers evidence of cover-up, accuses local hero." The article detailed Knox's terrified, unrecorded confession, the physical evidence of the whistle, and Crow's long history of intimidation. Suddenly, Margaret Hale was no longer the crazy, fiscally irresponsible librarian. She was a hero, a David who had dared to stand up to Goliath. The town, which had been so quick to turn on her, now began to rally behind her. The narrative Crow had so carefully controlled for decades was shattered in a single day. The families of the missing boys, who had been silenced by years of official indifference and quiet scorn, now had a champion. They organized, they held vigils, they stood outside the town hall with fading photographs of their sons, demanding that the case be reopened. Mrs. Dunlop, her frail body animated by a fierce, newfound hope, became their spokeswoman, her voice, once trembling and private, now clear and strong on the local news. The truth, once released, had a life of its own. It was infectious. Emboldened by Margaret's courage, other people began to come forward. A retired railroad engineer sent an anonymous letter to the newspaper detailing a series of suspicious accidents in the 1980s, all of which had been swiftly and quietly resolved by Richard Crowe, usually with a payout and a non-disclosure agreement. A former secretary from the rail company came forward with a story about Crowe ordering her to shred maintenance reports from the week the boys disappeared. The single, isolated tragedy of the three graffiti writers was transforming into something much larger and more sinister, a pattern of corruption and abuse of power that had poisoned the town for a generation. The community was waking from a long, troubled sleep, and it was furious. But Richard Crowe was not a man who went down without a fight. He struck back with the full force of his wealth and influence. His lawyers filed a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against Margaret, Eddie, and the newspaper, claiming they were engaged in a malicious smear campaign to ruin the reputation of a dedicated public servant. He went on the local television station, his demeanor calm, grandfatherly, and deeply wounded. He painted Margaret as an unstable woman obsessed with a fantasy, preying on the grief of bereaved families for her own notoriety. He held up his service awards, spoke of his lifelong dedication to the town's safety, and asked the people of Harmony Creek who they were going to believe: a man who had spent his life protecting them, or a disgraced librarian and a disgruntled security guard. The lawsuit was a brutal, soul-crushing blow. It was designed not to win, but to bankrupt them, to bleed them dry of money, energy, and hope. The town, which had just begun to rally around Margaret, was now thrown into confusion and doubt. The battle lines were drawn. Half the town saw her as a truth-teller, a Joan of Arc fighting for the forgotten. The other half saw her as a vindictive liar, tearing apart their peaceful community and sullying the name of a local hero. The whispers and rumors returned, more vicious this time. Margaret's car was egged. The library received threatening phone calls. And in the cruelest cut of all, late one night, a rock was thrown through Mrs. Dunlop's living room window, a note wrapped around it that said, "Let your dead son rest in peace, old witch." Crowe was no longer just fighting Margaret. He was now actively terrorizing the very families he claimed to have served. The hope of a quick, clean victory was gone. The truth was on trial, and the entire town of Harmony Creek was the jury. Margaret had succeeded in bringing the story to light, but in doing so, she had ignited a civil war. The defamation lawsuit was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Crowe's legal team was a machine, burying Margaret, Eddie, and the small-town newspaper in a mountain of paperwork, motions, and depositions designed to exhaust their spirits and empty their bank accounts. The library remained closed, its funding frozen indefinitely, a public monument to her supposed disgrace. Margaret was forced to take a part-time job stocking shelves at the grocery store just to pay her bills, the quiet dignity of her former life replaced by the weary anonymity of an apron and a name tag. Supporters who had been so vocal in the beginning began to fall away, intimidated by Crowe's legal power or simply worn down by the endless, ugly conflict. The hope that had burned so brightly after the story broke was now just a flicker, guttering in a relentless, soul-crushing wind. The truth was out, but it wasn't setting anyone free. It had just dragged them all into a new kind of prison, a legal limbo with no end in sight. Just when it seemed like Crowe was going to win, that his money and influence would successfully suffocate the truth under the sheer weight of the legal system, the one person he thought he had silenced forever found his voice. Herbert Knox, wasting away in the care facility, had been following the story on the common room television. He saw the photos of the grieving mothers, saw Margaret's tired but determined face, saw Crowe's smooth reptilian lies. The guilt that had consumed him for 25 years, a slow, corrosive acid, finally ate through the last of his fear. He knew he was dying. His body was failing, but he realized his soul still had one final choice to make: to die a coward or to die with a clear conscience. He contacted Sarah Jenkins through the same sympathetic nurse who had helped before, and agreed to give a formal, on-the-record, videotape deposition. It was his final act. Propped up in his bed, his voice a frail but steady whisper, Herbert Knox told the world everything he had told Margaret in the garden. He recounted every detail of that night: the boy's youthful recklessness, the hiss of the pneumatic lock, Richard Crow's cold, dismissive eyes, and the final, damning order to let it go. He confessed his own weakness, his own crippling fear that had led him to a lifetime of silent torment. Looking directly into the camera, his gaze was no longer hunted and afraid, but clear and resolute. It was the unwavering gaze of a man unburdening himself of a weight too heavy to carry into the next life. 3 days after giving his testimony, Herbert Knox passed away in his sleep. His confession was a bombshell from which Crow could not recover. It was no longer Margaret's word against a town hero's. It was a dying man's final testament, a voice from the edge of the grave, and it had the undeniable ring of truth. The videotape was played on every local news channel. Knox's quiet, devastating testimony, paired with the physical evidence of the whistle, was the 1-2 punch that finally brought Goliath down. Crow's carefully constructed facade of the benevolent community guardian crumbled to dust overnight. The defamation lawsuit was dropped. The town council, facing a furious public, immediately launched a formal inquiry. Richard Crow was stripped of his civic honors, his name chiseled off the plaques and town signs that had borne it for decades. He was publicly disgraced, a pariah in the town he had once ruled like a king. Though his advanced age and failing health meant he would never see the inside of a real prison cell, he was sentenced to his own kind of jail, a life of public shame, forced to live out his final years as the monster he truly was. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not a triumphant explosion, but a quiet, solemn dawn. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, almost 26 years to the day after the boys had vanished, the town gathered at the edge of the now demolished rail yard. The families had organized a joint memorial service on the very ground where their sons had last been seen alive. The air was filled with the sounds of quiet weeping, of shared stories, of names whispered into the wind. Margaret stood at the back of the crowd, a quiet observer. She watched as the 3 mothers, now frail, elderly women, their faces etched with a grief that had defined their lives, stepped forward to light 3 white candles. There was a new emotion in their eyes today, mingling with the ever-present sorrow. It was closure. Not peace, perhaps, and certainly not happiness, but the profound, heartbreaking relief of finally knowing. Eddie, standing beside her, stepped forward and gently placed the small, rusted whistle on the base of the simple stone monument that had been erected. A final belonging returned at last. It was a small gesture, but it felt immense. A final, quiet closing of a circle that had been left open for a quarter of a century. As the last notes of a hymn faded into the gray afternoon sky, Margaret looked at the faces around her. Mrs. Dunlop, Paul, Eddie, Sarah Jenkins, and felt a powerful, bittersweet sense of finality. Justice is never whole. It can never bring back what was lost. The loss remains, a permanent hole in the fabric of a family, of a community. But the silence had been broken. The truth, in all its ugly, heartbreaking glory, had been served. Margaret thought back to the little girl in the sunlit church, her hands clasped in a desperate, childish prayer. Lord, let their mothers know the truth someday. The prayer had been answered. And as she watched the mothers hold each other, sharing a sorrow that was finally unburdened by the torment of the unknown, she realized the cost had been worth it. The truth hadn't healed the wound, but it had finally, after all these years, allowed it to be cleansed.